Okay, we are going to get started. Some of you will be joining us a little bit late, which is okay. We have a great program here today. We're here to talk about the best practices to manage the new overtime rules. My name is Sunil Rajaraman. I'm the head of marketing at Replicon. Some of you may be familiar with the Replicon brand. We'll be doing an overview of Replicon later in the program, but we want to focus on the content and how to help you best manage the new overtime rules. I am joined here today by Brian Dixon, who's the co-chair of the Wage and Hour practice at Luler Mendelsohn, which is one of the top law firms in the country. And Brian is considered an authority on this particular subject, so we're very, very lucky to have him here today. Brian, what did you want to add in the way of an intro? I find that these intros, it's best for you to do it to do the proper justice.
Well, thank you, Sunil, and I'd like to thank Replicon for sponsoring this webinar this morning and asking me to join. I've been doing wage and hour law since, I might say, before it became fashionable. Along the way, I've written a couple books on the subject, do co-chair the practice group of now 300 attorneys at Littler offices across the United States. The wage and hour practice has really grown to be more than half of Littler's practice, which tells you how important it is for every employer to maintain good compliance with their wage and hour obligations. And Sunil, you have a few other thoughts?
I do. We're going to go through a bit of housekeeping to start with, and then we're going to dive right into the program. Our goal is to, next slide, please. We always like to start our webinars on a lighter note. We'll let you digest this comic here for a few seconds. Give everybody the proper context and in the right mindset before we get in. It's not a fun subject, but hey, we try to make things fun around here every now and then. Next slide, please. So a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So obviously we're going to do a broad overview of the change. The change takes effect on December 1st. What is it? How will it affect you, etc. We want to talk specifically about reclassification. We've done a couple of these webinars before, and in the previous one we found that 78% of our attendees said that they were going to reclassify employees from exempt to non-exempt. So we do want to dive into this issue a bit more. And so we'll talk a little bit about what you should do in terms of capturing time for employees, and in general best practices to manage work time. So these are the broad areas of that we want to cover today. So a bit of housekeeping. Everyone is on mute during the presentation. We are going to do a Q&A portion of the webinar where at the 11:40-ish mark, we'll be basically turning it over to audience questions. I would like to encourage you right now to submit your questions at any time via the questions text box located on the right side of your screen. We are expecting a lot of questions, and we want to get to as many of them as possible live on the webinar, so the sooner you submit them, the better. Last, there will be a poll during the presentation, and should shed some light on, on things that you are all experiencing. With that, Brian, I'd like to hand it over to you for the content portion of our program. Brian, take it away.
Thanks very much, Sunil. And why don't we go ahead and build the entire slide here, please. We are facing a large change across the United States, uniformly applying across the United States on the federal level in the minimum salary that's required for an employee to be overtime exempt. That minimum salary is jumping from $455 a week to $913 a week, or $47,476 a year. The salary, of course, has to be paid on a weekly basis. It's if you do any work in the week, you have to be paid your full salary for the week, subject to a limited number of exceptions. And that change is going to take place on December 1st. That's sort of an odd day of the week to choose. It's a Thursday, and if your work week for your exempt employee starts on a Sunday, for example, the preceding Sunday would be November 27th. We have to be prepared to have our new salaries in place on that date. The salary pay increase affects only those people who have to be paid a salary in order to be overtime exempt, which would be executive, administrative, professional, and in some cases computer professional employees can be classified as exempt. It doesn't change or impose any minimum compensation requirement for outside sales employees. There has been for some time, actually if you look back, way back in time, there's been for a long time a streamlined test for people who are highly compensated. Presently that test takes impact at $100,000 a year in annual salary. That'll jump to $134,000 a year, which is really a very robust threshold for someone to be subject to the shorter test for exempt status. One of the few indulgences to employers in the new rule is that an employer can credit against the minimum salary requirement certain, quote, non-discretionary bonuses or commissions. You do have to pay 90% of the new minimum salary requirement every pay period, and you have to pay or make up the difference between that 90% and the expected quarterly income or expected income on a quarterly basis, so that each quarter, as each quarter ends, an employee is making, with the bonuses or commissions added to the base salary, the new $913 a week. Let's take a look at how this is going to impact us over time, which would be the next slide. The change in the minimum salary has been very, very intermittent. At one point in time, I think there had been no change in the minimum salary from President Eisenhower all the way up through President Clinton and then a little bit beyond. And the minimum salary had actually fallen to the somewhat embarrassing point where it was less than the minimum wage multiplied times 40 hours in a week. There are a little bit of eco-politics or geopolitics that we should be thinking about here. You know, over the last several decades, we've seen a lot of industry and employers moving to the south for lower wage rates. With the new minimum salary requirement, at least for exempt employees, there will be much less of a cost savings in that movement. We also have to be attuned to the fact that this is a new minimum salary requirement for an employee to be overtime exempt from federal law. The new minimum salary requirement at this point in time, and I'll emphasize that, does exceed the requirements of other states, but other states will catch up. For example, California bases its minimum salary on the state's minimum wage. California's minimum wage will rocket upwards, as will New York's, to $15 an hour around 2022. Along the way, in 2018, for example, the minimum wage or the minimum salary to be exempt in California will eclipse the federal minimum salary, as the California minimum salary will rise to $49,920 a year. By 2022, when the minimum wage in California is $15 an hour, the minimum salary to be overtime exempt will rise to a very impressive $62,400 and odd dollars. So let's look at what our options are. If we can, take a look at the next slide. In terms of responding to the new greatly increased overtime, minimum overtime salary, as Sunil pointed out earlier, there are several options. One is to pay time and a half for overtime work, or pay overtime. In our last program, it appeared that 78% of the audience was thinking, you know, we're just going to reclassify everyone who's paid less than the new amount. There is a somewhat a very cost-saving, but how shall I say it, option that presents some careful compliance issues, and that is in most states, 44 to be exact, you can pay a salary and half-time overtime compensation. That's known as a fluctuating workweek pay plan. But any such pay plan should be implemented only with making sure that you're in a state which allows such a pay plan and with a written agreement with an employee, so there's no dispute about how the employee will be paid. We also have the options of increasing an employee's salary to make sure they make the minimum salary requirement, but that can cause compression and distort relative pay ranges within the organization, so it represents some challenges. And of course, when 2020 comes around, the federal minimum salary will increase at that point in time. So that may not be your long-term solution. You can always limit hours of work. That's one of the purposes of overtime. That's an affirmative goal of overtime. And you can, across the organization, of course, adapt each of those to circumstances that fit. what does the Department of Labor expect from us for those newly reclassified employees? That's the group that we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on some of the unique issues that may arise with respect to reclassified employees. And why don't we take a look at what the Department of Labor expects here. And it is, first and foremost, for people who are reclassified and who will be paid overtime, we need accurate record keeping. The record has to be in writing, needless to say, although these days an electronic writing is deemed to be sufficient. If you're using an electronic record, you want to make sure that you have what's known as an audit trail, and that is the ability to go in and see if a supervisor in the course of approving that time card has made any changes to the time card. And of course, you'd want to keep an eye on how often people do, supervisors do change time entries. Excessive time entries might be a supervisor who's not doing a very good job of managing the department, who might need some support in terms of training, or might be consciously doing something to make the budget look good, the latter of which would be a potential challenge because we might have some time shaving. You don't have to have a signed time card. In fact, an employee doesn't have to fill out his or her own time card. All you need is an accurate record. It has, of course, been customary in the United States for many years now that employees do keep their own time cards. It need not be a time clock. It could be handwritten, but in today's world where you need to integrate large amounts of data with the payroll process with minimum cost and maximum speed, an electronic record is certainly the most conformed you find. It is also helpful to have on your time card a certification that meal and rest periods were taken, or in those states such as California, where you can earn a premium by missing your meal period, that the meal period was missed. California and Washington. California also has the same premium for rest periods that are missed. Washington, we want to be aware of, actually requires an employer to pay an employee the 10 minutes for any rest period that's missed. Let's go on and look at why the group that's being reclassified poses significant and somewhat different challenges for recording work time and paying overtime accurately. The increase in the minimum salary is going to capture a lot of people in assistant manager positions, assistant store managers, assistant department managers, assistant everythings. In some cases, it may actually catch retail and service store managers or department managers. It's going to capture high-level administrative employees, maybe a fair number of systems administrators, some sales and marketing staff. It's going to have a fairly broad impact across the organization. What I think is important, and is the purpose of our presentation here today, that these are the people that you generally expect some initiative from. It's not like, they raise their hand and get pre-authorized for overtime. You can require, of course, pre-authorization for overtime, but do you want to take the people we expect initiative of and rob them of that opportunity? These people are expected to be responsive. They answer the phone outside of work hours. They answer emails whenever you have a question. These are people who are supporting the organization moving forward in a big way. And these are people who expect to be accountable. They follow through on their own to get things done. And the other thing is that these people may travel. They have more varied hours, and they have, in particular, broad and diffuse duties, which is really the purpose of our conversation here this morning, and that is to figure out when do those diffuse duties roll off of being work time, and when are they work time. Next thing important concept, especially for this group, if we can look at the next slide, is that what exactly is work that we have to pay for? Well, we have to pay for everything that we suffer or permit. Most of us know what permit is. Somebody asked, we said, okay, how do we suffer work? There actually may be a few employees that you go up to and say, would you inflict more work on me? It could be a little faster, a little more diligent. But suffer is really construed to mean just, did you know about it, or should you have known about it? And there are a number of important corollaries to that. The first one is, if you don't want to pay for the work, you have to stop the work. You can't know about it and let it go uncompensated. That is the basis for a lot of off-the-clock claims. Another common misconception, when we're talking about the limits of work time, is, I'll have a manager that I'm talking to saying, well, the employee wanted to do that, or she enjoyed doing that work. Well, for those lucky of us in the crowd, work can both be voluntary and enjoyable, but it's still work. Those are people who just don't have bad Monday morning. We'll also talk about another general parameter of work called the de minimis concept, and that's in the next slide. And, goes back to old Latin expression that the law doesn't really appreciate or require an employer to account for trivialities. But, these days, everything is measured very precisely. The emails show the timestamp down to the minute. Time clocks can record time down to the second. When is something so trivial that you don't have to pay for it? And the courts look at three things. What's the duration of the activity? The brief. They look at how repetitive it is. Is it something that happens daily, or is it happening just every once in a while? As an employee picks up the phone at home once every 6 weeks and has a brief conversation with the manager, much more likely to be de minimis than something that happens every morning before you go to work. And they look at the administrative difficulty of recording the work time. There's a historical trend that we need to be judiciously sensitive to here. Now, judicious is an emphasis point because the judges of the United States Supreme Court back in the 1940s, a long time ago now, said that up to 10 minutes a day of a particular activity might be considered de minimis, but technology's changed a lot since then, and our ability to record time has changed, and our sensitivity to how employees are paid has greatly changed. So you see a number of courts recently that say if regardless of the duration, if something is highly repetitive, you better think about paying for it. And again, a good electronic timekeeping system can help you there. Before we leave the de minimis rule, we want to again come back to the fact that one of our challenges as an employer is to comply not only with federal law, but with state law, which can vary from state to state, obviously, and increasingly with local laws, a city or county ordinance about a living wage that regulate wages and hours. One example of that is the California Supreme Court has now taken up the case which will consider whether and to what extent the de minimis concept applies in California. As a general rule, the courts have accepted that, harking back to the old legal Latin maxim that we all learned in law school. But we would not be surprised, I would not be surprised if there's a new spin to that concept here in California. So for those of us who are haven't reached the lunch hour, it's certainly short of that here in San Francisco, let's talk about meal periods and rest breaks for a moment.
And Brian, well, speaking of rest breaks, we're going to pause here for 1 minute, not even a minute, more like 15 seconds, to just remind attendees the question queue is filling up fast. So just a reminder to the attendees, there's hundreds of you on the line. We want to get to as many questions as we can, so please submit your questions as soon as you're able to, and we will get to them to the last portion of the webinar at around 11:40. Thank you. Brian, back to you.
Thanks, Daniel. Meal and rest breaks still exist. We may think that many of our staff eat breakfast while they're driving, drinking a coffee, eating a donut with the other hand, have the cell phone bud in the ear, and they're driving with their elbows on the way to work. But meals still do occur these days, and there are some rules around that we have to be sensitive to, and that is that a meal period has to be a basic rule, 30 minutes in duration, and the employee has to be relieved of all duty for it not to be work time. For the group of people that we're talking about who may be a little more inclined to be interrupted or who may feel rushed and want to take a short meal period, as long as we knew or had reason to know that the employee was taking a short meal period, we're going to be held to the duration of that meal period. So if we don't want to pay for meals for our newly reclassified group of employees, we have to emphasize to them that they are expected to take a 30-minute meal period. Some states, federal law doesn't require meal periods to be provided. That burden falls on the states. About 40% of the states actually affirmatively require meals to be taken. Some very civilized states like New York actually tell you what time, meals should be taken in relation to the lunch hour and the dinner hour in some regards. Illinois is a very hardworking state. The meal period in Illinois is only required to be 20 minutes long, but if you leave it at 20 minutes, you're likely going to have to pay for it. some states, California, Nebraska, it's very important for the employee to be able to leave the premises for a meal period to be non-work time. Here in California, that's when you get a chance to run down to the dry cleaners. In Nebraska, I've driven through Nebraska. You get a nice view, panoramic view of very pastoral cornfield. Probably more relaxing than a California meal period. We have rest periods too. Basic rule, rest period of 20 minutes or less is work time. Only 7 states require rest periods. You might look at it, catch an employee sleeping at their desk and saying, do I have to pay you for that nap? And if it was 20 minutes or less, you probably do, but that doesn't prevent you from disciplining the employee. And another collateral rule that we always want to remember there, in the case of a dispute about work time, you're generally better off, just about always better off paying for it, giving the employee some guidance, or if the employee is a repeat offender, giving the employee some discipline for failing to follow your direction. Training and meeting time will be very important for the group we're talking about. The next slide shows us some basic parameters here. One example of how life might change is we might be pulling department heads, assistant managers together once a week for a brown bag lunch. People get a chance to sit together, maybe chit-chat about nothing in particular for 15 minutes, and then the unit manager gets up and talks about the state of the plant, the unit, and some general observations about how the business is going, what we're expecting, what the results have been. Questions going to come up, is that work time? Well, if attendance was required, it's probably work time. If attendance was voluntary and people came because you offered a free lunch, always a nice benefit, we'd at least get over that hurdle. Is lunch outside regular working hours or inside regular working hours? A little bit of a ticklish question there. And lastly, is this really making the employee productive? Is it actually facilitating the employer's interests? And there's probably an argument that those meetings don't exist just for a social purpose. There's probably a strong argument in the view of the unit manager, and that he expects or she expects people to listen and to learn and to be able to coordinate the business better as a result of that. So you could wind up with a working lunch. The same rules apply to training time. It's got to, if you don't want to pay for training, it's got to be voluntary outside of regular work hours. No productive work is performed. The training is not job related. Well, what about employees who, for example, take training for advancement purposes? It's really directed to advancement. For example, a large municipality had special classes for police sergeants who wanted to become police lieutenants, and that training was directed to just being a lieutenant. You wouldn't have to pay for that because it's not making you more efficient in your current job, as long as the other requirements were met as well. And you could run into the same issue if, for example, we have a new software upgrade. We change software vendors. Everyone's eager to learn how to work with the new software. And some employees are very eager to learn and help facilitate organizing an after-hours class. It's voluntary. But if it's directly work-related, i.e. it's how our custom software is done or how our work processes are reflected in the software, you'd have to pay for it. If it was, really voluntary, really outside of regular work hours, and it was just general training in the software, hi, here's how you use this developer's software here or there or anywhere else, this is portable training, then you may fall into the exception for training that is similar or congruent to that you would find in an institution of public institution of learning. The next slide will bring us to probably the sense of our days, and that's on-call time. Increasingly, one of the correlates of the electronic world that we live in is that we can all be reached at all times of the day, and we may feel that we are perpetually on call. For those people who we have to pay overtime and the minimum wage to, of course, we have to be more sensitive to that. And I think the one thing that one of the most common questions I've had for employers that are transitioning employees from exempt to non-exempt is, what about phone calls on the weekend? What about being available on the weekend? What about being available after hours? And the challenge is that when we're looking at whether on-call time is work time, we have to think about whether a number of criteria have been met, and in most cases, they may point in different directions. The most important criteria are how frequently are you called, how quickly do you have to respond? Do you have to stay close to a particular location? And any other limitations on an employee's time. I had an on-call case, originally didn't look too bad. It was for a tow truck driver, and the response time seemed reasonable, and the calls weren't too often. This was in a small town, and then we got into what other burdens are there on the employee's time, and as the employee rather eloquently said, you know, I have to not only be on call, but I have to keep the tow truck with me, and can you think about the impact of a big yellow truck has on your social life? Had an interesting case for paramedics in a small town, had a 0 response time, which really makes you think the on-call time is going to be work time. This is a sort of odd situation where the paramedics actually could stay at the facility. It had become, for a variety of reasons, a little bit of a very social spot. Good friends could come and actually stay, and we had a little difficulty sorting Party Central out from the very serious business of immediate responses to medical emergencies. I think the most interesting on-call case I had was an employee who, as might be expected, denied that he could go anywhere or do anything while he was on call because of the restrictions on response time and the frequency of the calls. And he persisted in that until I subpoenaed his credit card receipts, and then he began to concede that maybe he did go shopping and maybe he did go to that restaurant, you know, 20 miles away while he was on call, and our case moved to a very a reasonable resolution. One other thing that the group of reclassified people are likely to do is travel. So let's take a look at the slide that addresses travel time and be mindful of that. You know, people who are in responsible positions, a lot of the people who are being reclassified, have meetings to go to that may not be at their work location. They may have responsibility for a district of stores or facilities and may have to travel. They may want to travel to trainings. The corporate training center may not be close to where they're located. And one of the things that I hear clients saying that the employees are being reclassified fear the most is the loss of training opportunities. Really, we talked about when training time is compensable, but also simply the fact that travel to training is going to be a cost factor, and that travel opportunity may go away. Well, let's think about travel for a second. Starting point is that the home to work commute, assuming home is not the workplace, is not work time. And if you are hired to work at a variety of locations, and it's always prudent to make that clear if in fact you do that in your offer letter, how you're employed to work in this district, not to work at that store, then the home to work commute is not work time. And we'll come back to one or two exceptions to that. But travel from job to job is work time. If I go to store 1 and then I have to travel to store 2 in the course of the day, then that travel is work time. And even if I volunteer to work at store 2, we want to remember the suffer permit standard, that travel is still going to be work time. Special one-day assignments, that is, if you work at only one location, you're asked to go to another city for 1 day. Could be from New York to New Haven. It could be from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. Could be from Chicago to Kenosha. That out-of-town travel will be work time to the extent that it exceeds your regular home-to-work commute. Overnight travel isn't work time to the extent that you are a passenger and it falls outside of regular work hours. Query these days, what are regular work hours when it seems that working all day is more and more the norm? We want to remember that states are free to define travel differently. Here in the late great state of California, all travel is considered to be work time. So if one flies on an overnight trip, even if you fly outside of regular work hours as a passenger, you might be reading, enjoying a movie on the plane, you're still working in the view of the California Labor Commissioner. One subtlety that we want to keep an eye on is if you're a telecommuter or if you work at home, you have to be attuned to the fact that if home is workplace, then travel from the home workplace to somewhere else can be work time. It's a very subtle subject. If, for example, you really do regularly work at home and once a week there's a meeting in the office at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and everyone is expected to drive in and then drive home when the meeting's over at 2, I would say you've got high risk of job-to-job travel right there. You might think about when you schedule that meeting and tell employees don't work in the morning before you come to the meeting so that you can at least cut off some of the travel. And you'd want to make sure when you hire that person that they know they have to work in the office some days of the week, other days of the week, so that's a multiple workplace employee. If, on the other hand, you work at home, you work in the office, you go home, and at some point in the evening you have to update a report, but it's your decision as to when that occurs. It doesn't have to occur in close conjunction to the commute, then the commute time is probably not work time. Let's take a look, and at Donning and Doffing, we'll talk about this really quickly because when an activity is work time is a very complex subject. You can spend a lot of time on it. Our time is a little bit short this morning. I do look forward to the questions. Talk about donning and doffing. Basic rule is that if the employee can take the uniform home and put it on at home and wear it back and forth to work, it's not work time. Some corollaries there are you want to make sure the employee has sufficient changes of uniform so that they don't feel constrained to do that. If you are required to put your uniform on at work because of sanitation reasons or just publicity reasons, employer doesn't want its logo shown outside of the workplace, or perhaps you are the doorman at a deluxe hotel and you wear a striking uniform that the employer really wants to be associated with its premises only, then you're going to have to pay for the changing time at the workplace. For those of you who require protective equipment, special rules will apply. Those rules get even more complicated as you become a union employer. One of the very, very few circumstances in which an agreement can limit what activities are considered to be work time is where there's a union contract. The union can agree with an employer that certain clothes changing time, a term of art, is excluded from compensable work time. Let's go on and talk about some red flags. These come up in the cases that I handle all the time. Some of them are so recurring that they, in some regards, I have to say, have a small amount of humor to them. Probably the first one is when you have an off-the-clock claim and you look at the employer says, not possible, look at these pristine time cards, and it's always 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and lunch was 12 to 1, and you're thinking, you know, if life was that perfect, there wouldn't be any need for managers or lawyers. It's telling us that there's probably some problem with the recording of work time. One thing I would emphasize, you know, you can have a supervisor whose employees have a significant number of missed punches, incomplete time cards, late additions to the time card. You got to think of that as a performance issue for the supervisor. That supervisor is not effectively managing his or her subordinates. And you want to bring it up as, you know, first training, just to make sure we're not going to lose a valuable contributor there. But at some point, it has to fall on the supervisor's plate. The supervisor's not managing effectively. One of the things that has become a really recurring source of dismay for employers is the fact that we leave electronic footprints in many locations these days. We have an electronic time card, but we have email. And, you know, the most common off-the-clock claim I get is people working either before and after their shift, or in particular working at home at night, and the plainest proof is, look at the email trail. You know that I'm working off the clock because I'm sending you emails in the evening and you're sending them back. It can be rather embarrassing. So, and, you know, we have multiple systems too. We have customer service records, and boy, those customer service records and the service call times better match the time card. I'm going to finish with some best practices for work time and hand the program back to Sunil for some questions and some thoughts about timekeeping. What are some best practices in terms of managing work time? And why don't we build the entire slide here? There are some keys. One simply is training. The most common problem is a supervisor didn't know that a marginal activity might be work time, might not, you know, could have been work time and should have been treated as such. And you want to train your employees as well. And you want to train your employees not only to know what work time is so it can be accurately recorded, but you want to train them to use the company hotline if there's an issue. One of the problems, you know, I'm often asked to do audits of employers' pay practices, and one of the things I always tell clients is, you know, the hardest thing to come up with is off-the-clock work, because usually it's coerced in some regard. And you're going to have problems with, there's always a risk of off-the-clock work because the supervisor didn't understand, the supervisor gave the wrong message, the employee heard it the wrong way. You really want to have a hotline or other outlet, you know, an invitation to come directly to HR when an employee is not being paid correctly, The HR, any questions about this paycheck, call HR. It should be in the message box on your paycheck stub. There should be the phone number. There should be the email address. Another thing is just structure activities to avoid things that are ambiguously work time or not. If you really need somebody to be on call through the middle part of Saturday, out of IT, a help desk person, maybe you should just schedule them to work 4 hours, because the call frequency is too high. Rather than saying, well, the call frequency is just a little bit low, but you only have to answer the phone, so it shouldn't be too inconvenient. And you can always tell the employee to do other work in the gaps between service calls. I think the most common issue I have with on-call time is that this is something that's very important for the group that's being reclassified, is often employers don't think about when they really need people to be on call. Do I need somebody on the help desk 24 hours a day, or is it sufficient that they're on the help desk from 5 p.m., usual closing time, till 10 p.m.? By 10 p.m., and on the weekends, maybe more hours on Saturday than Sunday. We need to be judicious in that regard. For those of you who business is to service other clients, you may have to talk to sales and say, let's not overpromise. We've got a lot of reclassified people. They're used to be exempt. They're non-exempt now. We have to pay overtime for them. You need to be a little more careful what you promise in terms of responsiveness and time of the day and the speed of a response. Another solution is more time clocks closer to work areas. It's just a great way. We have a lot of discussions about, we only have one time clock, and then people walk. Do I have to pay for the walking? But they stand in line. It's a long, it's a long wait at shift change. One of the things I say most often is just more time clocks closer to work areas. Watch rounding that operates to your benefit. You have to work to the benefit, equal benefit and burden of both of you. And finally, make sure you audit. You don't have to ask everyone if their time card's accurate, but someone in HR or payroll should be pulling a sample of time cards every month at random and calling those employees and saying, hi, I'm just cross-checking your time cards. I want to make sure you're being paid for all your hours worked. How are things going out there? What do you do at the beginning of the day? Some substantive questions. What do you do at the end of the day? Is the time clock process working for you? Any questions about your paycheck? Not only is it going to save you a great deal on wage and hour potential liability, but it's more importantly going to build a lot of goodwill, so people will bring questions to you and not taking them to the plaintiff's lawyers that I deal with every day. So, Sunil, what do we have?
Hey, Brian, that was excellent. That was excellent. Thank you for the overview, but you're not done yet. We're already getting dozens of questions. So I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the audience, if you could please submit your questions now, and we'll try to get to as many as we can, but consider this the last call for questions, and we'll be getting to questions momentarily. In the meantime, Vivek, I believe we have a poll for our audience. At our webinars, we like to do these polls because we uncover some interesting things that are sort of unexpected, and we like to share with the wider group. So our previous two polls, 48% of our attendees in 2 webinars ago agreed that the rules change is going to have some sort of impact on them. And in the previous one, 78% of attendees said that they were going to reclassify employees from exempt to non-exempt, which is pretty interesting. So today, we're asking the audience, what do you think will be the greatest record-keeping challenge with respect to reclassified employees? You could take a few seconds to answer that. For the benefit of the whole audience, we appreciate it. And the poll is live. And I'll halt for a second here. Give everybody another 15 to 20 seconds here to answer the poll, even quicker, maybe another 10 seconds. And let's go ahead and close the poll and see where we are with results. We do have, like I said, hundreds of attendees, so maybe we can share with the group what the. Okay, interesting. Calls and email outside of regular work hours. Brian, you touched on this a bit. Just the ongoing challenges around time capture as it relates to people working, different times. So it looks like it's a I mean, as you think about the Q&A session, Brian, this appears to be, a major issue, as I'm sure you encounter in your own practice.
Well, it is, and it requires a good deal of forethought on the part of the employer. Some employers may find it more convenient, in order to avoid the off-the-clock issue, simply to say, I'll budget, a quarter of an hour a day because I want you. You're a senior admin. I want you to check your email once a night. Instead of starting it being as catch can, we're going to pay you for it. We're going to schedule you for it. We'll pay you 15 minutes, or if you keep time in tenths of an hour, we'll pay you a minimum of a tenth of an hour, and then we'll pay you, for any amount in excess of that. Catching, the now and again call, if it's a high frequency of short calls, would be really a challenge, and the thought about getting that on the time clock is enough to make me shudder. It might lead you to think of a variety of alternatives. One, of course, is to have an app on your phone that allows you to keep time. Another is, do we really need all of this after-hours chatter, or did it just become convenient, and do we want to tell some of these people no more after-hour emails and phone calls and try to limit our potential liability? So some good issues there.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. So we're going to get to the questions shortly. I'm going to do a very brief overview of Replicon, and that way you know who we are and why we're even hosting this webinar to begin with. As many of you know, and some of you are existing customers, some of you are new to us, but for those of you who don't have much context, Replicon, we've been in business for a long time, around 20 years, and we are experts in enterprise time management, as we call it. So we use modern user experience and technology, cloud-based technology, to basically provide your business with the tools it needs to manage and capture time, all the way to managing and tracking the profitability of individual projects, and at the firm level, if you're in professional services, assessing the profitability overall of your firm. The nice thing about Replicon is, we're very flexible. We adapt to your business processes. You don't have to adapt your business processes to fit our solution. And we have a completely organic experience, meaning we didn't cobble together a bunch of different disparate solutions and put it under Replicon. Instead, we built everything from the ground up, so it's a coherent and seamless experience. And as it relates to time tracking, we have thousands of customers who trust us with, solving issues like the overtime law, which all of you here are here in attendance for. We have global scalability, which means, we're not just a U.S.-based solution. As your business grows and as your needs grow, we can scale with your organization and help you internationally. And because we're capturing information in real time, you can analyze it and make real-time decisions. So that's something that we pride ourselves on, and something that all of you will encounter as you navigate the new overtime rule changes. Only one or two other housekeeping notes that I have. The first is, for a summary of the overtime laws, please go to Replicon.com. At the top of our homepage, there is an infographic which you can download, which gives you an overview on what to expect. So please download that infographic. It's a handy cheat sheet that we created that you can use as a reference guide leading up to December 1st. And for all existing customers or prospects, if you have any question at any time as it relates to the overtime laws, Replicon, or anything in general, email us at webinars, that's plural, webinars@replicon.com. If we don't get to your question in the Q&A session, we want to try to get to your question at least offline, and we can forward some of those to you, Brian, as appropriate, if you're okay with that. And webinars@replicon.com. Infographic, email us. The second thing is, if you have more specific questions, go to email webinars, plural, @replicon.com. Webinars@replicon.com. We will answer any questions that you have that were not answered on this webinar, or point you in the right direction. We are grateful for all of you attending this webinar today. We will reach out to you individually anyway, in all likelihood. For those of you who are existing customers, we want to work with you to make sure that you're able to make the transition successfully. And for those of you who are not, we're interested in helping. Thanks for attending. Brian, huge and hearty thanks to you.
And thank you, Sunil, for the opportunity.
And look forward to hosting more in the series and shedding light on the changes before they take effect. That closes our agenda. Hope you have an excellent week and expect to hear from us soon.